Hello, good morning to some of you and good afternoon to others. My name is Sean here with Linked Senior. We are going to get started in just about 3 minutes at 1 o'clock Eastern on the dot. If anybody does have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to push those into the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will try to address those. But other than that, we will be getting started in just a few minutes. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Again, my name is Sean, and I am glad to get us started with today's webinar on Ignite Purpose with Resident Engagement, featuring our hosts or our speakers, Nancy Ewald as well as Charles de Vilmorin. A couple of housekeeping details before we dive in here. As you'll notice, you've all been muted. This is to make sure that we stay on time. So today's webinar will last 1 hour, and that's including leaving some time for Q&A at the end. But we want to make sure to keep out any of that background noise. On top of that, we want to make sure that we can address any questions that you have. So there is a chat box as well as a Q&A box that are available to you. Please feel free to plug anything in there, and we'll either address them during or more likely at the end during the Q&A. Now, of course, today's webinar has CEUs associated to them. At the end of the presentation, towards the end, I'm going to post a link to a survey in the chat box. You can either click that link and take the survey through there, or following up on the webinar, you will get an automated email about an hour after we shut down today, and it will also have the link. For anybody that would like to get a CEU for today, you must fill out that survey. So even if there's only one of you signed in and there's 5 of you watching, make sure that each of those 5 people take the survey, because those are the ones that we will be associating the certificates to. Those certificates will go out on Monday, as we need time to process all the attendees. And other than that, all of the information will be available for you if you have any questions. So let's go ahead and get started here. Today's objective is really to learn about the past, present, and future of resident engagement. So I'm going to give you a quick overview, a quick insight into who the speakers are, and then I'm going to turn it over to let them really talk about activities and resident engagement and the evolution over the last 20 years, the current and future states of resident engagement, best practices and trends to improve the lives of senior care residents, and as I mentioned, we will leave time at the end for some Q&A. So our first speaker today is going to be Nancy Ewald, who is the founder of Activity Connection. Nancy has a master's degree in allied health education. She was a previous national program director for Marriott Senior Living, and she's the author of Growing with Activities and other instructional and how-to manuals and publications. But of course, we all know Nancy is the co-founder of Activity Connection, the premier online resource for activity and recreation professionals. The other speaker today is going to be Charles de Vilmorin. Charles is the founder and the co-founder and CEO of Link Senior, a resident engagement platform for senior care, with over 9 years in the healthcare and long-term care space. And Charles is a certified dementia practitioner who actually got his master's thesis on nursing homes, writing the nursing home folklorian paradigm. Excuse me, I can't talk today. But with that, I want to turn it over to Nancy to get us kicked off here.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. You really have to ask, where would we be today if it were not for the changes in the industry over the past 20 years? So I'd like to begin by exploring some of these changes and what impact they had on resident engagement and activity programming. 20 years of change. A real paradigm shift came in the late 70s and early 80s with the emergence of assisted living. In a reaction to the traditional nursing homes, people were saying, you know, I want something that looks and that feels more like home. And assisted living communities sprang up. And during the 90s, the real boom years, there was a real push to deinstitutionalize. And in part, the reason the assisted living industry grew so quickly was because it was unregulated. They didn't have government mandating what activity programs they had to have, if any. And so it was a very fuzzy period for those who worked in assisted living. However, the free market soon took over, and companies quickly realized that if they wanted to stay ahead of the competition, they had to set themselves apart. So we started seeing companies advertise things like, we have a special exercise program, or we have a unique learning program, or we have a partnership with a local daycare that makes us better than our competition. It was assumed that the basic physical needs would be met, but families and prospective clients were really shopping for those extras. So as a result, there was the realization that a quality activity program was not only good for residents, but it also sells. A good program leads to happy customers and families, which leads to good referrals, which leads to a better bottom line. We were beginning to see a movement probably from the medical to the social model. Then the natural evolution was the resident was saying, you know, I kind of like it here now, and I think I'd like to stay around for a while. And then the families were saying, I know mom is declining, but seriously, are you saying that I have to move her? Do you know how hard it was to convince her to leave her home in the first place? And can't you just bend the rules a little bit? So the industry was, and then the industry was saying, you know, this constant turnover is costing us, and we have to maintain, how can we better maintain our census? So assisted living communities and to some extent independent living began reinventing themselves so people could age in place. And what this meant to activity programming was that the population had more diverse capabilities. So we started seeing new assessment tools were developed to help identify compatible groups. We began to think smaller groups. The goal was no longer to get everyone to every activity, but to get the right people to the right activity. Parallel programming became a familiar term. The challenge, of course, was how to meet all these individual goals with the staffing constraints. So we started seeing care staff, excuse me, begin being asked to pitch in on the evenings and the weekends. And then the concept of the universal worker was introduced, that maybe everybody does everything. Maybe that's the solution. Then by 2010, Alzheimer's disease was the 6th leading cause of death in the United States, and no setting was spared. Dementia affected all of the settings from retirement communities to the healthcare. As programming evolved to meet these needs, it was recognized that the nature of the engagement might actually play a more important role than the actual activity itself. In other words, the how became as important as the what. And we had to learn new techniques of engagement, like redirecting and coping and adaptations and Montessori techniques of engagement and so forth. The new thinking was approach, approach, approach. Approach is everything. And that there was a realization that sometimes it's the journey, not the destination, that really counts. And then another change more recently is the change in demographics. There are younger people, especially in assisted living. Hospitals are pushing people out and into short-term rehab situations. We're seeing younger people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, the war wounded, and those with drug-related issues. So there's a greater demand for programs that are relevant to the younger generation. And we have to remind ourselves not to get stuck in the big band generation or even in the rock and roll generation. Also, we're seeing more minorities and a population that's ethnically and culturally more diverse. So at Activity Connection, we're actually seeing more requests for things like, do you have Russian? Do you have German? How about Chinese? Can I get that puzzle in Chinese? So as a tip, try Google Translator. It's really getting better all the time and can be a very useful tool. So 20 years of change resulted in other changes. As the industry changed, there was a recognition that there needed to be other changes. We needed to change how we think about the services, how we deliver these services, and even how we talk about them. Culture change, changing the culture, meant not only changing the culture within the community, but it also meant changing the organizational culture. It meant changing the way we think. And it's kind of an oversimplification, but culture change involves rethinking our values. It's a shift in the philosophy from a kind of an overemphasis on safety and medical issues towards promoting person-directed health and quality of life. And if you will indulge me a memory moment here, I had a really wise resident tell me once that she said, if I didn't have any vices, and she had several vices, she said, if I heeded all the latest advice, and she said, beets are good for me and I hate beets. And she said, if I never took any risks, she refused to give up her high heels even after hip surgery. She said, I could live to be 100, but I probably would wish I hadn't. So what's the trade-off? By the way, she finally gave up smoking at the age of 95 and was just 1 month short of her 100th birthday when she passed away. Every time I think of Ella, I think of the Frank Sinatra song, I Did It My Way. And I think that amplifies culture change. Along with culture change, the why came kind of person-centered care, or the what, where the person's needs and preferences come first, giving them more control over their lives. So they can enjoy much more of the privacy and the choices that they would experience if they were still living in their own home. It's not just putting the person first, but the person is directly involved. The person using the services is an equal partner with the person delivering the services. So how does this affect traditional activity programming? In theory, bingo has to be treated just as importantly as bath time. And if there's a conflict in scheduling, the person's preferences come first. If a person prefers to watch movies in the afternoon as opposed to in the evening, accommodations have to be made. And to drill down on each person's individual preferences means even more detailed assessment tools. It means more individualized one-on-one programs, more parallel programs. Again, the challenge still being, is there enough manpower to meet these diverse needs? And we'll explore some of those solutions later in the presentation. Then the new way of thinking and delivering services also means a change in how we talk about these things. Words matter. You'll notice it is person-centered, not resident-centered care. And my favorite example of person-centered language is, instead of bib, it is a clothing protector. So if you just think about that for a minute, if you say Mary wears a bib, you have one picture in your mind. If you say Mary wears a cloth protector, clothing protector, you might picture yourself eating crab legs at the local crab shack. Instead of feeder, it's a person who needs help with food and drink. It's move in, move out, not admit discharge. And related to activities, it is Tom did not wish to attend exercise today, not Tom refused to attend. So the concepts and changes we've talked about so far, these are not specific to our industry. They are universal concepts of wellness, as Charles will elaborate.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Good afternoon, everyone. So just a quick word about this dimensions of wellness. I'm sure we all heard about this idea of, the word wellness, but I think that we mustn't forget that this concept, which was initially designed by the World Health Organization, is evidence-based. And beyond being evidence-based, is applicable and has been applied in every single segment of our population, whether it's the child, the early adults, and so on and so forth. So I think that what's important, and I love what Nancy has been saying in terms of I did it my way, but remembering what we're trying to do with our resident, which is ultimately address them on who they are. So a couple comments on that. One is this idea of wellness. What is important about it is not necessarily the amount of dimensions we have, whether it's 7 dimensions or 8 dimensions. There are providers that actually have a simple model with 3 dimensions, right? Mind, body, and spirit. What's important is that it's as holistic as possible. In other words, that we take into account who the resident is, what they need, and what they prefer. I love what Nancy was saying about the assisted living changing the way we as activity director work. And again, it's really about understanding who is the person and how do we incorporate their own terms. And I think that a lot of it we're kind of seeing everywhere now, given all of the new regulations. So maybe, Nancy, would you mind explaining that a little bit and some of the changes that you've been seeing in the new regulations?
Sure. One of the biggest changes took place last year with the new CMS rules. And although culture change and person-centered care are not mentioned per se, you can see these concepts in the added words. There's resident preferences, their choice, individual and independent activities, promoting independence and interaction in the community, a sense of belonging. The bottom line, the person's preferences and wishes drive everything. And so a musician must make music, an artist must paint, a poet must write. I think that's, yeah, there you go. What a man can be, he must be. And another memory moment I'd like to share, a colleague called me one day asking if I had any advice. She had a resident, let's say his name was Bill. He lived in an assisted living and always sat in the corner of the lobby reading a book. And so she would try to draw him out and encourage him to participate in other programs, but he really wasn't interested. And his family was concerned because he wasn't doing enough, and they were starting to express some dissatisfaction with the company. So she was under a little bit of pressure. So she said one day she approached Bill and made the comment, "Bill, you're always sitting reading. Wouldn't you like to put it down the book and join the exercise class?" And she said it was not long after 9/11. And Bill's reply was, "I like to read. Reading is how I roll." And I think that this quote says the same thing. So what counts as an activity? Well, the old way of thinking is if it's not on the calendar, it didn't happen. And I'm sure many of you out there remember that. The new thinking is that every encounter, event, and interaction presents an activity opportunity. Unscheduled activities can be just as meaningful, if not more meaningful, than scheduled programs. And activities, as defined by the new rules last year, are, quote, refer to any endeavor other than routine ADLs that is intended to enhance his or her sense of well-being and to promote or enhance physical, cognitive, and emotional health. These include, but they're not limited to, activities that promote self-esteem, pleasure, comfort, education, creativity, success, and independence, end quote. There's that word again, independence. Independent and self-initiated activities count. Not only are they recognized, but they're actually encouraged. And not everything is scheduled or planned. Some of the best experiences are spontaneous or unexpected. For example, if a housekeeper is dusting a room and she notices a collection of antique thimbles and strikes up a conversation about sewing because she is a sewer, that counts. A note I'd like to make, I'm making a distinction here between what counts as required reporting in the records and what counts as it relates to, is this an engagement that is pleasurable and meaningful? The CMS guidelines also state that some ADL-related activities such as manicures, pedicures, hairstyling, makeovers may be considered part of the activity program. But actually, I'd like to make the case that other ADLs are also activities. To me, taking a nice hot bath at the end of the day is really an activity. And mealtime to me is a great social activity. And yes, people watching counts. Taking in the environment, that counts. You can count me in on that group, actually. In fact, my kids are always embarrassed to sit with me in an airport. Mom, you're steering again, they would say. So, Charles, if all these things count, how might we define engagement, and why is the term engagement better than activity?
Thanks so much, Nancy. If ever I see you watching people, I know what you're up to. But yeah, so the word engagement, we hear it often today. It's very buzzy. We talk often about family engagement, about staff engagement, but there is something as resident engagement, and we don't have to look far. Actually, in literature related to dementia, Dr. Jessica Cohen-Mansfield came up with this concept that any kind of stimulation or ways to involve, so remember what Nancy was saying, like the choice, but ways to involve the resident, that is part of what is engagement. And the reason for that is that it helps the resident lead a better quality of life, it helps with social engagement, and ultimately it helps with quote-unquote clinical outcomes. So I know that we as activity people were very focused on the tasks of activities, but I think there's a lot to be said about kind of expanding a little bit our eyes and mind and thinking, what are all the ways that a resident can benefit from, again, being involved, being occupied, because all of that leads to engagement. Now, I think something that's really important in this is also how do we create spaces that foster engagement. And I think, Nancy, I'm pretty sure you have good ideas about that, so I'll let you explain that.
Okay, thank you, Charles. So the bottom line, activities happen when there's interaction or connection with the physical or the social environment. You have to have things and you have to have people to interact with, especially if you want to encourage independent, self-initiated types of activities. So an interesting, and I would also add enticing physical environment might include things like a stack of puzzles in the library, a basket of interesting seashells sitting on a coffee table, old hats hanging on a hall tree, a trivia board, a display of cartoons or funny pictures, plants, pets, fish tanks, having supplies out and available like coloring books and pencils on coffee tables and newspapers and magazines. The bottom line is you have to have stuff and interesting stuff visible and available. I should make a note, there are some special precautions and limitations in the memory care, but in general, you have to have things for people to interact with. And another note I might make is a community can look busy and not be messy or cluttered, which can be a concern of the marketing department when they're giving a tour. Then you must also have an engaging social environment. Another memory moment, I was observing a community one time, and as I sat for about 5 minutes around with about 5 residents around the nursing station for a couple of hours, I noticed that the administrator came through and stopped briefly and engaged everybody. The activity director came in and reminded everyone of the upcoming program. The director of marketing also stopped by to ask Mrs. Smith if she needed anything. However, the nurses and the care staff who were right there rarely engaged. So that kind of got me to thinking about the concept that all employees should recognize they are surrounded by what I call, excuse me, an activity zone or their engagement zone. And if a resident is in their zone, they should be engaging, even if it's just briefly, like, I love that color on you, Mrs. Jones, or do you think it would look good on me? In addition, they should know that Mrs. Jones likes to play bingo and should know that bingo's at 2 o'clock. So are you going to bingo today, Mrs. Jones? Other tips might be becoming a walking activity where you would wear a name tag that says buy a vowel and see if anyone can solve the puzzle, or wear an interesting sweater or a tie that is a real conversation starter. And carry an activity in a pocket. Pull an unusual rock out of your pocket and ask the gentleman on the couch, you know, I found this in my garden. Any idea what kind of rock this might be? And besides the physical and the social environment, there are other probably less tangible factors that also encourage and affect engagement. For example, keeping things fresh. Is the physical and social environment changing? Have you ever noticed how much buzz you create when you change your decorations for the season? So add new books to the library, change displays, keep it interesting. And also, have you ever noticed how much conversation and interaction there is when a new person comes into the community? I wonder who that is. Is that Bill's daughter? So invite family members to lead a discussion. Do you have an employee who has a new baby she'd like to show off? And also, don't be so predictable. Surprise with an unscheduled afternoon ice cream social or a music program. If you think about it, what gives you more pleasure? Your husband phoning and saying, I made dinner reservations at your favorite restaurant, or him surprising you with a candlelight dinner when you walk in the door? So unscheduled surprise activities are great. And then create curiosity. Create a curiosity corner where you can display new gadgets or curious information. And one of my favorite memory moments, it was Star Trek Day, and I had a pair of Spock ears that one of my kids had worn for Halloween, and they were very lifelike. And I thought it would be fun to wear them to work that day. And at the time, I wore my hair in kind of a shoulder-length bob, and so the tips of the ears just stuck out above my hair. I wore them all day, and to my surprise, not a single person asked me about or even said anything to me about it. I would get a lot of very strange looks, and then people would be off whispering in a corner. And at one point, I sat down on the couch next to a woman, and when she asked how I was doing, I replied, oh, I've got an earache today. And she looked at me, and all of a sudden she goes, oh my, and she hurried off. And at the end of the day, I went into the dining room and pulled off the ears, and everybody just kind of gasped. And I said, did you really think these were my ears? And one woman replied, well, we didn't want to hurt your feelings, but we thought that's maybe why you wore your hair the way you did to cover those ears. So it was a very curious day that resulted in a lot of social engagement and interaction. So all these things are a measure of kind of the warmth index of your community. Instead of hearing, there's nothing going on around here, you'll hear, this is friendly and a happening place. So once we recognize that engagement can happen anytime, any place with anybody, then it's all hands on deck. It's everybody's job. I recall once visiting with a resident and him turning to the aide, changing his roommate's bed and asking if she could turn on his favorite television show. And she replied, and she was very polite about it, that was not her job and that he should ask the activity assistant to help him. She wasn't being obstinate or contrary. This was just kind of her understanding of activities. You would not expect to see that reaction today, however. If a housekeeper or administrator or other staff member notices the grandkids are visiting or spending the afternoon, and they know that the activity department has a toy box to share, do they say something? Yes. And do they make sure that the event is brought to the attention of the person who might need to make a note in the records about the event? Definitely. And it takes a village sometimes, so our families kept informed about what's happening so they can participate or be cheerleaders and encourage participation. You know, with the new technology, it's becoming much easier to keep families involved, even if they live thousands of miles away. So that brings us to our next objective. So where are we now, and what does the future of resident engagement look like? Although culture change and person-centered care are now familiar terms, there's still work to be done. Old habits are hard to break. It's hard to pause from changing the linens and escort a resident to exercise class, knowing that it might put you behind for the rest of the day. And it's still hard to accept that, yeah, it's okay for Bill to just sit and read all day. It's also hard to implement the vision. In theory, if a person prefers to paint a picture in the evening instead of during the regular scheduled afternoon art class, then accommodations must be made. So you can see the challenge this presents, especially with staffing constraints. One question you might ask here, where are the volunteers? Volunteer programs are becoming harder because most women are in the workforce and everyone leads very busy lives. So volunteers are not the solution they once were. So it can be a challenge to meet expectations. For example, how do you get care staff excited about helping with the program in assisted living or in memory care? And how can you still ensure that the quality of that program is up to the standards you'd like it to be? So an important tip here is get them invested in what kinds of programs they present, rather than assigning, well, say Lily to facilitate the afternoon news group. Give her options and ask her what kinds of programs she might like to participate in. Perhaps she really enjoys crafts or loves reading joke books. In addition, make sure that you give her the tools for success. So present her with a well-prepared, complete program so she can feel good about the experience and she's more likely to want to repeat it. But then there's another consideration, and where do you get the time? The 6 P's of programming. Speaking of time, and on the subject of challenges, it's not always appreciated that most scheduled programs and even unscheduled individual programs have 6 steps. Actually, these really form the premise, another P for activity connection. You might have heard, hopefully in the past, we hope, we want back-to-back programming, no downtime. Well, the 6 Ps can explain why that's not always possible if you want a quality program. For example, it takes time to plan out what you want to do. It takes time, thinking time. It takes assessing residents and deciding what to offer. Then you have to prepare the program. And if you don't invest here, then you're left with quick off-the-shelf programs, which are not always meaningful. And then you have to promote. You always have to be a cheerleader and spread the word and spend time reminding people. This is one reason we are big on signage at Activity Connection. And then there's the time actually presenting the program, which is the time we enjoy the best. And then there's pick up and put away and paperwork. 2 more things, and don't forget the ET, that's the time spent escorting and transporting. So the goal is to maximize number 4, presenting programs, and to minimize the others. Technology can help, and that's our mission at Activity Connection. Charles will now expand maximizing these and discussing what the future holds.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's fantastic to see. I mean, I know you've been in the industry for years now, and why you created activity connection, which is ultimately to help us drive better engagement for the residents. And I think that, I shared that a little bit as I founded Link Senior. I think we're all really excited about what the future holds. But something that I also like looking at is, when you consider what do we envision the future, there's this quote that says that actually the future is already here in some way. It's just not evenly distributed. So as we go along in this presentation, we talked about the past. Nancy gave us this perspective. We talked a little bit about the present. Now, let's talk a little bit about the future and see what are some people doing, how are people looking at, what are the challenges, but also the opportunities when we consider engagement. And as much as Nancy did it, talking about activity connection, I will be sharing stories from the Link Senior perspective. There are many other products out there that we invite you to consider. The idea here is, again, how do we help our residents, our staff, and then our residents as much as possible. So one thing that we are really passionate about is what's the state of things today, right? And there's this CDC report out there that sadly points out to the fact that our residents only get 11 minutes of engagement a day, right? And in these 11 minutes, it's sadly often the same standards as the 3 Bs, right? Bingo and Bible and birthdays. And a lot of places, thanks to activity connection, have made tremendous progress since there, but there are still places where the activity calendar is the same day in, day out. The types of activity offered are very similar. And the reason why that's important is, as an activity director, as I went through the education to become a certified activity director, I understood that one of the challenges is, understand who are the residents that need us the most. And it's very difficult today. It is one of the biggest challenges, but also areas of opportunities to know who are the residents that need engagement the most. Now, obviously, this challenge exists for a very good reason. Nancy discussed these a little bit, but basically, the population relies on us a lot because of cognitive or physical impairment. Often, sadly enough, in skilled nursing homes, it's 60% of residents don't get a family visit. So, again, they rely on us. And although we've made a lot of progress, what I'm supposed to do as an activity person is I want to, every single time, every single day for every resident, assess the resident. That means understand who they are, right? Nancy might like American football, but me, Charles, being French, I might like soccer, right? These are different story points. And based on that, the experience should be better, right? I should be getting things around soccer, French music, and as we plan things together, maybe I should be paired up with other people that might speak French. And if Nancy speaks French, maybe I could see her in a few activities, right? And then we want to implement the program, and we want to evaluate. The reason why companies like Activity Connection and Link Senior are very passionate about this model is the fact that although a lot of these things are still paper-driven, there's a lot of opportunities in bringing everything together, because ultimately, this is how we meet the needs of our residents, but we also support their purposes. So there's a lot to be said, we believe, at thinking about how can we create a world, how can we create a future and bring the future closer to us where engagement is almost part of the treatment, right? I think we need to acknowledge the fact that this is a very healthcare-driven industry, and we are using some of the medication just because that's what we do as an industry. But how much can we make sure that the person who needs music therapy gets music therapy with the right song, right? Again, French for me could be something else for somebody else. Again, adding Senior and Activity Connection, we're passionate about that. But I think that for the audience here today, we just recommend that you think about, again, Nancy's approach with the 6 Ps, this assess, plan, implement, evaluate. What are the tools out there that help us, again, engage the resident and make sure we're doing a good job? And when we do a good job, make sure we're actually recording it, because we want to get credit for it, right? Especially given some of the family expectations, or sometimes with the new regulations. I think that another thing that we're seeing more and more, and this is again this idea of the future being closer, is, a lot of people have been focused for the longest time on just mitigating behaviors, or people that were kind of needing it the most sometimes. And I think there's a lot to be said. What I was preparing this presentation with Nancy, we agreed on the fact that all of our residents need us. And I think there's a lot to be said about even the residents, that can use self-directed activities or kind of engage themselves as well. Our role as an activity industry, as an activity profession, is to make sure that every person can have this stimuli, this involvement. Because even for the people that need us less, there's a lot to be said about building and maintaining cognitive reserve. I think that we're very adverse as a field of measurement, but I think that when we see people working in the industry, like some of the greatest progress are around the fact of trying to understand what it is that we and the rest of our team are doing, right? And it's not because we want to be copped around or just kind of make sure everything happens all the time. It's more that the closer we understand how we're engaging our population, the better we might be at supporting our staff, supporting our families, and maybe supporting our residents. And I'll give you one example. Look at this screen here. The green section highlights our group activities, our one-on-one, and our intervention. We all know that non-pharmacological interventions are the best way to help people through behaviors. But I think there's a lot to be said about trying to, instead of mitigating behaviors, to try to prevent them. And this is, sometimes quite easily done if we think about scheduling one-on-ones, right? So if I had that as a person in charge of activities, I would look at that and then say, is there anything I can understand from these non-pharmacological intervention where I can go to the resident, for example, if we have somebody sundowning, and make sure that we are trying to prevent that behavior. So these are quick thoughts. And these things are happening, right? We are seeing, whether it's in assisted living, in nursing homes, and memory care, people are doing that today. So I just want you to be aware that this is definitely there. One of the big challenges in our industry, in our field, is also, why, right? And Nancy and I have been talking about, we know that we engage the residents, it's better for them, it's better for the business, like the business and the regulation and satisfaction. But sometimes people forget what is the connection. And as an activity director, if I go in and see my administrator and I ask, double my budget tomorrow, I have difficulty kind of explaining why. And we're very excited because there's a whole body of research out there that explains that. But when you look at the best practices and trends to improve the life, we're getting more and more evidence that the more we engage, the better it is. And one example of that is at Link Senior, we're very excited because we have this ongoing clinical study where people are using our product, and we are then analyzing clinical outcomes in the electronic health record. And we're excited that we just got preliminary results that point that not only can technology help reduce isolation and depression, but it also helps reduce behaviors associated to dementia. And there's an actual strong correlation that shows that the more we engage the residents, the better the outcomes. And so this is exciting for all of us, not only because it kind of explains that the research is true, like what we see in the literature is correct, but we actually have very tangible results today of staff having tools to engage more of the residents, and that leading to better outcomes for the residents, the staff, and the businesses. So that's very exciting. One of the reasons why some of these providers are able to do that is a concept that we're all very familiar with, right? It's the idea of the pyramid of Maslow. And this explains that it puts into perspective all the different needs that us as humans have. We know that you cannot get to the psychological needs if you haven't addressed your basic needs in life. Same thing for the self-fulfillment. When I was preparing this presentation with Nancy, we were thinking, you know, the world tomorrow, as we serve our residents, is a world where this pyramid is very heavy at the top, right? We're so good at helping them with their basic needs, their psychological needs, that we're really helping our residents being in this self-actualization mode. And some of it is done today, right, with creativity, again, music and so on and so on. The question is, how do we make sure it's done almost every single time for every resident, right? So with that being said, some of the good questions we like to ask is, how do we get there, right? How do we do that? And using the same concept of the pyramid, we then asked ourselves, how do we build a model that way? And I know that some of us are doing that. We know that some of us are doing that. The question is, how do we organize that so that we all do that? And this is probably something that I would encourage the audience to take back at work as much as possible, right? That would be one of the big takeaways, which is, if I had a question about the way I work today, and I wanted to change it slightly, what would I do? I would ask myself questions. I would ask my team questions. And simple question, which is one, are we engaging everyone, right? I mean, we do still see places where they don't really know. Yes, it's in the record. Well, can you show it? No. And so that's, you know, that's the very valid question. And then obviously the next one is, are we engaging based on needs and preferences? And this is probably something that the family is asking. We know the new rules of participation for nursing homes are asking for that. But again, can we prove it? Can we show it? And then the third one is, are we thinking about outcomes? I think we all know that outcome is the goal, right? Whether it's quality of life, healthcare outcomes, but are we thinking of what is the goal for every single resident? You know, a good example was Nancy saying, well, for me, I would get happy, I'll be in a good place if I was people watching. So no use of, you know, forcing Nancy to come to every single activity. People watching, maybe, you know, sometimes daily, weekly is good for Nancy. And then the fourth one, which is really tough, is, are we prioritizing? And not saying that some people are more important than others, but there is something to be said as the same in the classroom with students. Sometimes there are residents that need us more. And it's not only people with a lot of behaviors, it could be somebody that we haven't seen because they're stuck in their room for the past, you know, almost a week. There are risks there associated to isolation and depression and so on. Right, these are just simple questions, but they're actionable. I think ultimately, and this is kind of something I'd like us to consider as a field, is if you are to think of activities in 5 years, or even in 10 years, whatever, like what would you like to be graded on? What would you like to be proud of? Right? And I think that as an activity professional myself, I would love to say one day I had a way, I had a method, I had a tool to say, well, these are my residents. This is what I know of them. These are the needs, these are the preferences, this is how they roll, to use Nancy's words. And here's what I've done. Here's what my team has done. And ultimately, being able to compare both, right? Wouldn't that be exciting to know these are the population that I love, these are the residents that I love serving, this is what I've been doing. And it's not to give myself a grade, or maybe I would want that, but it's also to understand how we're doing so that we can do better and better, because a lot of us in activities, we love what we do. We just want to, you know, have the tools to do it better. And the exciting thing is that there are different teams of researchers. One of them is led by Kim von Heitzwein and Katie Abbott, which are trying to understand how to put these models together. Katie will be actually on our next webinar with Link Senior in a month talking about PEDI, the Preference of Everyday Living Instrument. But they are trying with other projects to find out what is this, and the term they use is called a congruence rating, but trying to understand as a nursing home, how well is the nursing home engaging their residents based on, again, who the residents are and what has been done. Now, as I've been explaining a little bit what some of the technology can do, what the future holds, and what are people doing today, I think that it's a great segue back to Nancy, because she has obviously more experience than I do, but she also has different perspective when it comes to what are the biggest opportunities, what are some of the challenges, and what excites her today as an activity professional. Nancy, back at you. Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful, Charles. Well, technology is here today. So what are some of the ways that it can make your job easier and make you more successful? We've already touched on how technology and the internet can maximize the time spent engaging with residents and minimize the time in the office. But technology and the resources on the internet can also increase the number and variety of individualized and one-on-one programs that you can offer. And that's without breaking the budget or going on a hiring spree. For example, you can afford to present the history of marbles to one person if it's already prepared for you. But if you have to spend a lot of time preparing, then you need to get more bang for your bucks. There are also new tools, smart boards, smart TVs, touchscreens, apps. More and more companies are providing iPads for their activity department. Also, and this brings me back to what Charles was saying, also with the new assessment tools, tracking tools, and evaluating tools, there are emerging ways to better evaluate the success and progress of your program. And these tools can give you the evidence you need to justify your program and to help influence future changes. And one thing to remember is data is power. Let me say that again, data is power. It can help you make the case for the changes that you would like to see and for the things that you feel are best for your population. So embrace these new tools. I'm not as close to the front line as I was 20 years ago, but back then you could tell how successful a program was by how cluttered the activity director's desk was. A clean desk was suspicious. There were stacks and stacks of paper. But today, instead of thumbing through a lot of paper, finding the right puzzle, running down to the office and making copies, you can simply open the folder on your computer and you can print the puzzle, or you can display it on the big screen television. And then there are the opportunities that technology presents for new types of programs for residents. There are We Exercise games that can add a variety to your existing exercise programs. Computer learning activities are being scheduled. Some communities have Sunday Skyping and Friday FaceTime programs to help families keep connected. And instead of people watching, how about Panda Cam watching? There are drag and drop coloring programs and new things almost every day. But what are the challenges? What challenges does all of this new technology present? Today, with regards to computers and technology and their role in programming, we're kind of in the instructional stage. Many seniors have to be shown how to use technology, and they're a little cautious sometimes. However, in the not too distant future, and probably within the next 10 to 15 years, seniors will know the computers. They'll probably have their own personal computer, and they won't need us to show them how to engage with technology. One last personal moment. A couple of weeks ago, I was attending an afternoon Easter program with my 94-year-old father. And I had my phone on the pew next to me, and occasionally I glanced down at it. And Dad looked at me very disapprovingly. "Can't you put that thing away?" he'd say. I then nodded my head and pointed out to him that the woman sitting in the pew in front of us, who was probably at least 85, was texting on the latest iPhone during the whole program. So for some, the future is now. One concern going forward might be similar to the concern parents and experts have with our kids spending too much time on the computers and not getting outdoors for exercise or making personal connections. But there are some things that technology just can't replicate or replace. You can't enjoy a party with, excuse me, with friends on a computer. A game of solitaire on the computer can't replace playing bridge with friends. You might be able to drag and drop colors and paint a picture on a computer, but that doesn't replace the sensory experience of smelling the paint or selecting the paintbrush or mixing your own colors. The creative satisfaction is not quite as complete. So going forward, the challenge might be how to encourage meaningful personal relationships and how to engage away from the computer. Instead of attending a workshop on how to boot up new ways to use technology, the most popular session in the next NCAP convention in the future might be how to power down new ways to connect. In conclusion, Charles asked me what excites you about the future of engagement. And after thinking about it, I realized that what excites me about the future of activities is probably the same thing that excited me 20 years ago, when Tom McLaren, an 88-year-old retired professor and author who suffered from pretty advanced dementia, wandered into our evening drama club meeting. And over the rumblings of the group, what is he doing here? He doesn't belong here. I invited Tom to join in, and I gave him a copy of the script we were rehearsing for an upcoming Independence Day program. And I asked him, I said, would you like to read the part of Benjamin Franklin? Well, Tom, when it came time for his part, he stood up, straightened his back, he lowered the glasses down on his nose, and he peered over the top, and he began to read with such wonderful inflection and expression and accent that there were notable gasps of surprise from the rest of the group. And after that, Tom played a part in every performance, and he was always a hit. Not only that, but you would hear, "Hi, Tom, come on in," when he wandered into our program, and people actually competed to have Tom as their dinner companion. So not only did that simple act of inclusion make a difference in Tom's life, but it made others see the real Tom despite his dementia. And I really think it made a difference in their lives too, because they became more accepting people. And what excites me today, again, the same thing as seeing the look on my friend's face when I'm able to show him how to FaceTime with his great-granddaughter, or how, even though he has failing eyesight, he can call his daughter by simply speaking her name into a phone. And what excites me about the future is still being able to make a big difference, sometimes with the very simple act. It's still one of the most rewarding professions you can choose. And besides that, you get to work with really, really cool people, right, Charles?
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. This was fantastic. It's so empowering to see someone that has your experience, your experience, but also your knowledge, to still be excited about what it is that we do as activity professional. I found that very rewarding, but also exciting about the future. And yeah, you're right. I mean, all of these older people are cool, and some of you might be familiar, but we launched this campaign, this project called All People Are Cool, and one of our closest contributor has been Activity Connection. And we invite any one of you or anyone that wishes to participate in that project. You know, we started with just having simple stickers, and then we got calls, people asking for more stickers. And so we just started a website to be able to create a platform about the fact that the people we serve, these older adults, are cool. Something to be reminded is that everyone is cool, right? But I think there's a lot to be said about how much are we trying to respect everyone, including the older adult. And we know of anti-ageism. So this is our say in it. We invite you to visit it. We also invite you to look at the store. We actually pass all the money, the profit we make, to the Alzheimer Association. But we thought it was a fantastic idea to finish off this presentation. So Nancy, thank you so much for all of your insights. It's great to be working with you, love your stories and also your advice. And with that, we'll open up to questions. And on the next slide, you have all of our details if you wish to contact any one of us. Sean, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Charles and Nancy. I had a lot of comments coming in throughout. People loved the presentation, but we did have a couple questions. So before I do that, just again, reiterating the housekeeping details, I did post the survey link into the chat box. So again, you can take it there, or it will be also available in the post-webinar email that will be sent out to everybody. Secondly, quickly just mentioning our webinar that we're going to be hosting next month on May 17th. As Charles mentioned with Dr. Katie Abbott, we're going to be introducing the Introduction to Preferences for Everyday Living Inventory, the PELI, and other evidence-based tools that promote purpose and quality of life. That link to register will also be in your email and will also be follow-up. Now, going back to some of the questions here. So as I mentioned, we had a few come in. And one of the first ones that kind of jumped out at me, as we invite other staff members or departments to engage with the resident, how would you do this, and which are the best departments to ask to help?
I can take that question. Really, all departments can get involved. And I think, naturally, care staff and nursing staff get involved in the healthcare setting. But I think it begins with kind of an education of the staff to make them realize that everybody has a role to play when it comes to engaging residents. And so I think the secret there is to get the person invested in what kinds of programs they might like to do, rather than saying, well, the maintenance guy has to give a program on this, or the marketing person has to give a program on this. I think the secret is to get them invested in what kinds of programs that they would like to do. And you'll be surprised. I mean, you might have a maintenance man who would just love to lead the men's group. Or you might have a marketing person who would just love to lead your humor group. So I think that's the secret. I don't think there's any particular department that you can exclude from being part of the process.
Okay, awesome. And kind of as a quick follow-up to that, are there any best practices or recommendations that you would give to get other departments who might be a little bit more difficult or resentful to engage with the residents? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to how far have we come with the whole culture thing? Do other departments really accept the fact that activity programming is just as important as bath time, or activities are just as important as mealtime? So again, it comes back to kind of educating the staff as to what's important. But again, I think it also comes back to the fact that people, if somebody's successful and they get that real positive feedback that you get when you have an interaction with residents, and experience that kind of rush that you get when you have a successful program, if other staff members can also have that same experience, they'll become as addicted to the programming as you do.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Nancy. I know there are a lot of questions that have come in, and which is fantastic. Unfortunately, we are up against the hour here. So what we will do is take note of those. And as a follow-up, we will certainly address those for each of you. So don't worry, your questions will get answered. But for everybody else, I do want to thank you for joining us today. If you would like a copy of the handouts, again, those are available, or of the presentation, those are available under the handout section on the right-hand side of the GoToWebinar box. And other than that, please remember, everybody who attended, whether you signed in or you joined, take that survey. The certificates will be issued on Monday, and we look forward to having you join us again next month. Thanks again, Nancy.
Mm-hmm.